Welcome to The Lost Signals Discusses Literature,
where we apply the revolutionary Mott skill
to classic and contemporary works of prose.
So, join us once again, won't you? Hello and welcome to another episode of The Lost Signals Reviews Literature. And this is a kind of a special episode because it's a two-parter. We're doing Heart of Darkness in this episode, and then we're also going to be releasing Apocalypse
followed
Now.
by Apoc Now.
Yep, which they're both... Oh, Apocalypse Now is based off of this work. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, and these are the savages I'm attempting to civilize. Scott Thurlow.
Just trying to fix the steamboat, man.
And Stephen Hermosi.
How's it going?
Okay, Scott, you have funny logline?
I don't know if it's funny, but it is a reference I like, so I'm going to go with, this is Congo Spring Break, 1899. If you get that, good on you.
Nice.
All right, and we'd like to continue with the plot.
Sure. So basically it's a story within a story. A bunch of mostly English shipmen are sitting out in the Thames just waiting for the tide to go so they can leave. And one of them, named Marlowe, starts recollecting, telling a story of years ago how he found himself in a job for a trading company into the Congo, taking command of a steamship to go upriver to the inner station of the trading post and meet a man there named, very well-renowned and well-regarded figure, or at least shrouded in mystery, but also the most profitable man who was returning the most profits in the ivory trade, Mr. Kurtz. And basically, as he physically journeys up the river, he sees increasingly, let's say, soul-harming things. Mm-hmm. And when he finally meets Mr. Kurtz, he has found that Kurtz has gone a little bit out there, and sees in Kurtz the darkness, the horror, if you will, that very famous thing that Kurtz saw in himself and in his situation, and sort of Marlowe brings a little piece of it back, and he's like, yup, and that's what happened to me. All men are evil. like parentheses. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but a lot of it goes to theme. So essentially it's the story of him going up the Congo River to ostensibly do a job in trading ivory and meeting again, sort of a mythical-like figure and seeing something about the nature of humanity and what happened to him and his experiences.
No, it's a nicely concise summary. One of the major points in this is that the Belgian
I think they're a Dutch trading company.
Dutch trading company is, and actually, it's historically, I believe, one of the kings, Leopold, promoted basically the pillage of Africa, with the idea that they're going in to civilize Africa. So, Kurtz, who went in initially with perhaps to find himself in a way. You don't really know his motivations besides what other people tell you throughout this.
Well, he speaks about they speak about him coming out and then going back in, which is like a really interesting insight into his character, which I guess we'll get to a little bit later.
But you're right, that is an important part of it.
But Marlowe, the main character, is going on a similar thing, that he's doing this because he's kind of tired of doing the regular sailing, and this seems like an opportunity, and he's intrigued by this character who he kind of feels a connection with, that maybe a similar mind with a similar kind of soul-searching desire. And as they're going through, he realizes that all of the thing about civilizing is bullshit. The people back home, the rich people who are funding this, believe that like his aunt, but the people who are there are just bureaucrats, really. The initial
or
bureaucrat
thieves, or both.
Yeah. The initial bureaucrat he meets is dressed incredibly well and attempting to keep up appearances, even though there's, like, basically he's mining or working slaves to death there. And as he proceeds, he goes to another one where the bureaucratic order is starting to fall apart the farther he goes, but it's a bunch of different bureaucrats kind of fighting, jockeying for position. They're spying on each other.
It's all political backstabbing and stuff.
But because all they know is that bureaucracy that they're have been born into, and they're in a world that they are trained that these people aren't people. They're savages that you can exploit, and they're trying to. And then Kurtz, meanwhile, who you have to. It's kind of weird because you meet him, and in a way, he kind of bought into his own bullshit.
Yeah, well, that's kind of always been the point of this character, yeah.
But I think he went in and realized that he could become the philosopher king, but he quickly became the tyrant.
Yeah, right, of course.
And now you've seen him in his last days of dying from, I suppose, malaria or something.
It's heavily implied to
illness.
be malaria, I think. I've always got that out of it, but yeah.
But you need to witness through Marlowe all of the absurdities and the fact
And
that
atrocities
the
as well.
exploitation and all that to understand Kurtz's character, which is what Marlowe's also trying to do. And he ends up meeting his hero, and you never meet your heroes because they always disappoint you.
And it's completely kind of, it's this whole, like, the entire idea of this story and why it's so famous is like it's a really well done description of like a descent into madness, right? And in the same way why Apocalypse Now is regarded so highly. And that being said, like, it's a really fascinating, like, seeing where his head is at when he meets these characters in the beginning of the book versus when he meets them at the end of the book. He kind of like loses his, like, he's actually impressed by the guy who is well dressed in the beginning, whereas I think if he had met him towards the end of the book, he'd be like, "What? Who the fuck
You're
is
just a
wrong with
pompous
this guy?"
idiot
Yeah,
anyway,
like,
which he always was that, but yeah.
Exactly. It's not like those characters have changed. Marlowe has changed in his progression down the river,
Kurtz, yeah.
and you kind of get an idea into what Kurtz went through as well via his progression through this story. And I think it's really interesting to see when he finally gets to the end. Like, I will say, I'm probably going to give this I want to give it a 3, but I might give it a 2, just because the beginning's a little bit slow for me. It took me a little while to get into it. The story overall is really pretty impressive in terms of like scope and telling something that, like, really a lot of times you'll see an old story like this and it'll feel old. It'll feel like overdone. But you don't see this story told very well all that often unless it's this or Apocalypse Now. Really, I can't think of another thing that like
many things
shows the
use it as a
descent
template,
into
yes.
like this descent as well as either one of these two things. Right?
Well, what's fascinating to me, and maybe this is themes, but you can't really.
It's hard to extract them. Yeah,
there's references to Dante throughout this, and it is not only a descent into madness; it's a descent into hell in a lot of ways. Especially the first when he enters the Congo at first, when they're doing the blasting the rocks for a railroad that's never going to actually be finished, and people dying under the shade of the tree grove, and it's weird that like Kurtz's kind of becomes a cautionary tale for what Marlowe might have become if he swapped places with Kurtz.
Yeah, if he had been the first to go out there instead of like the mission, you know.
I don't know. It's I think that unfortunately this story, especially, it's a very modern story, but written in the style of the 1800s, which is when it was written, obviously. So there are parts that, if it were written today, and Apocalypse Now is actually a very good example of that, in which we're discussing, it could be a more concise narrative, and I think that it falls into the traps. Like, I understand the ending of him returning home and him realizing that Kurtz actually means nothing. He's an empty vessel for ideology, just like the ideology of the Dutch company, and that people saw what they wanted to, and his fiance, his cousin, people like, oh, this mysterious figure, and it's actually really exemplified by his final line, the horror, which means nothing. It means everything if you want it to mean something, but in the end, it's just like his ideology. It's absolutely, he is a flawed human.
That's almost what I love about that line is like, you see that line, and so this is the first time I'm reading Heart of Darkness, and also I realized as I was watching it, I thought I had seen Apocalypse Now, but I'd never seen it all the way through, and so it was the first time I watched Apocalypse Now all the way through, and like, so I got to the third part of Heart of Darkness, and then I watched Apocalypse Now before finishing the story, and I saw that, so you get the horror line from Apocalypse Now, and then it's the same thing in Heart of Darkness, and both times I'm just like, yeah, I mean, I get that this is really affecting, and it affects me.
Mhm.
But what the fuck is he talking about? Like, what are you talking about, man?
I think
like, you know, like,
but that's weirdly
that's exactly what it is. It's so surreal at that point in both of those. Like, it's so far into, you don't have any tether to, like, your previous civilized life anymore. I guess that, like, quote unquote civilized, that is, but like, you know, that you have this line and it's like, wow, that's fucking super deep, and then you're like, is it really? Like, it doesn't actually fucking mean anything, or like, it's not. What is he talking about?
But the Russian trader is actually he's a sycophant who everything he does is perfect.
Yeah,
he can threaten to kill me. It all means something, but it might not, and that's the beauty of it. He might just be. It says he gets the ivory. Why does he get all that ivory? Is it to please a system that he shunned? Is it just because that's all he knows?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know a ton about Kurtz aside from him dying at the his dying throes, and aside from that, he wants his legacy to mean something. But it doesn't actually mean anything. It's just what people look at and want to impart upon it.
Which is a brilliant turn of the story, is like having Kurtz be alive for a very short time, and I love that both of these things do it. I mean, I gotta stop talking about Apocalypse now, but like, I love that this story does that, because it's like he's basically the sole object of Marlowe's attention for the entire book, and then you find him, and it's like he's just a withering, dying man. Like, yes, you can see flashes of the brilliance that man was, but
or supposedly was.
He's clearly like out of it. He's dying of malaria. He's like gone, I don't know, like native, I guess, like also quote unquote, like, you know, like he's kind of divorced himself from the civilized world, we'll say. And it's really fascinating that you like find him and like, here's what I've been fucking searching for, this brilliant man, and then he's like delirious, and then he dies. And that's it. And that's all you get. And it's like, oh man, like this is what the whole like civilizing societies has led up to, is like building towards. It's like this, like,
That's a big letdown.
Exactly. It's just a huge letdown.
I mean, it's always been the point. So at least to me, and this is probably the third or fourth time I've read Heart of Darkness all the way through, and similar to when we get to, I know you mentioned Puck, but I've also seen it a number of times. But having said all that, and like you said, we just explored themes a little bit here and there, because I think you can't really.
It's hard to divorce them, yeah.
But as a narrative, you're almost going to say your score. So I'm looking at a strong 2, and here's why. You alluded to it earlier, E, that I think I'm going to deduct a minus 0.33, repeating, of course, from each section, from part 1, part 2, and part 3. Because, yeah, someone could be a little slow. Like, sometimes you get, like, almost too much of Marlowe describing, like, what the jungle looks like. Like, yes, it's a good style, which I'll speak about, but I'm just saying, narratively, it slows down a little bit, I think, in each part. Thus, I think I'm going to deduct a point from a fraction of each.
Conrad writes with a paintbrush. And at times granted, it's very important at times. He does a very good job at times in it. And other times it's superfluous. And
yeah, well said.
Yeah.
I think I agree with that.
So I agree. It's going to be a very strong 2, but 2 nonetheless.
Yeah, just for that.
Same.
And again, like you said, maybe it's a sign of the times is my final thought, but nevertheless, it still does impact the narrative just a bit, just to take it down a bit.
All right. Stephen, on to themes with you.
Well, I think we've already delved into this fairly deeply. There's all these like themes of kind of colonialism that are embedded in this story, and
The absurdity of human endeavor.
What Conrad thinks of colonialism, and certainly it should be mentioned that. Well, it has to be mentioned somewhere that this book is like kind of racist.
It's fairly racist,
and yeah, I mean, there's you can make the excuse that it was written in 1899, which accounts for some of that, but it's difficult to get through certain parts of it because of the descriptions of things that are happening.
And the perception he's presenting.
But what I would say is, and the reason I mention that is because I think it has to be brought up, right? Like that's part of it. And if you want to read this book, you need to be able.
It's gonna be there. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to be
Gotta
able
deal
to
with
know that that's there, and either say, okay, that's fine, I'll take the good with the bad, or say that's not for me.
Now, I am going to bring up that it's slightly nuanced racism because different characters are racist in different ways.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of the Dutch bureaucratic figures who look at these people as not human at all. And Marlowe, and by proxy, Conrad, almost takes a racist because they grew up racist, and then he at times is like, oh no, these aren't the monsters I've told or savages. They're human just like white people. And yeah, that's fucked up in very many ways, but the reason that to me there's an interesting thing is that the comparison between the people who are like kind of systematically racist versus a person who grew up that way and is kind of changing their mind. I
found as like you get deeper into the book, it's more like, hey, like you said, it's like, oh look, these people are also humans, which is yes, fucked up, but it's the idea of kind of this is where we started at this most like heinous section of the scale, and we're building our way towards something that's better.
The one character it seems that Marlowe actually gives a damn about throughout it is his helmsman.
His helmsman, yeah, who gets killed. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a part of this, but
But that did need to get mentioned, I think, just because.
Sure, no doubt. Cool.
It's an important part of what makes this book. But like I think the overarching ideas are kind of what makes a man, and like that, a lot of that goes into like, I'm using quotes so much in this, but like, are the quote like savages any worse or better than us? Like when it all comes down to it, and like
all humans have the capability.
It opens with Marlowe musing about the Romans when they first came to Britain.
Yeah, I was going to mention style, but yeah. How they must
but it's thematically very important for this conversation is that like at one time we had a group, and I like the fact that, and this goes to the broader theme of the bullshit behind colonialism, is they were here for conquest, and that's what we're in the Congo for. Or if you want to bring it to modern times, when people say we're going to democratize the Middle East, it's that same kind of concept of it's just some kind of bullshit justification
really
when
throughout the ages,
it really just is conquest.
Yeah.
And that these are just people, and when you're taken out of your element, you're like, and you are brought back into dangerous situations and things like that, what will you become then?
Yeah, I mean, of course I agree with that. It's always like Heart of Darkness is very influential work. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of strange that you're not. But I understand like not everyone has necessarily read it either. But yeah, because it touches on all that, because it has its tendrils and all those things that are still relevant, everything he touches upon can have almost a parallel, as you mentioned, like to things happening today, because it's sort of timeless themes, I would say. Yeah, yes, the exploration of like, who you are in the dark, what you can become, like when you've given up all, I'll use Steve-O's quote unquote morality, or like your quote unquote civilized mindset, if you will.
Or do you have morality and all that because you have a paved street with policemen and neighbors that
you live a comfortable life?
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, like what happens when all that goes away?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to give it a 1.
I, of course, I'm giving it a very strong 1. Yeah, like I said,
well,
it's just influential. Like you mentioned, Spec Ops: The Line. Like just real quickly, it's this template and like the sentiment of it has been used by so many things, Apocalypse Now, and so many other things too. That I think the reason that is the case is because it's so resonant, because they're still relevant, and you can get that out of the story to this day.
For sure.
So I'm going to go on to an antagonist, and I'm going to say that Kurtz is Marlowe's antagonist to this.
Super
also
interesting antagonist, by the way.
Yeah. And the fact is, he doesn't really. I mean, granted, it's impetus for everything, and doesn't really necessarily antagonize him until the end of it. But the fact is that, in a sense, he's built. You don't know what Kurtz is. No one knows what Kurtz is. The people who loved him don't. His African bride or mistress or whatever she was probably knew him the best of everyone there. And is he a tyrant? Is he a benevolent individual? Is he
a genius or a madman or both?
Is he just a capitalist who's looking to benefit from the ivory trade? You don't know, and the fact that he's built up to be a legendary figure, and when he's stripped down to just a human with none of those features or touches of all of those features, is ending up meaningless and all around, and only cares about what the legacy will be, and he has nothing really to show for it. I think that makes him a fascinating character, and again, going into Apocalypse Now, so we're going to talk about that. I think the Kurtz there was, because probably the performance was better fleshed out in a sense, but I like the fact that we see this legendary figure only at his lowest
He's basically a shade of himself in all cases, like in all senses of the word. And yes, I'm going to agree. He may not be antagonistic in the traditional sense of the term, but certainly he occupies Marlowe's thoughts the further he gets up. He's obsessed with thinking about what he's going to do when he meets Kurtz, as he hears and sees the chaos around him. And it's very effective, and like I said, in a bit of a non-traditional way, but I still think it works very well. And a lot of it, as I said, bleeds over into themes, as we just discussed. So Kurtz also is kind of a thematic antagonist, I guess I'll say.
Oh, for sure. Like it's fascinating how much it's not Kurtz isn't necessarily the antagonist. The idea of Kurtz is the antagonist in this, and that's way more interesting to me. It's I think it's a fascinating thing that Conrad builds up as he writes this story, and I really was impressed with him being able to keep bringing up the same thing, like this idea of who's this guy? How am I going to measure? It's always, I feel like it's always Marlowe being like, how am I going to measure up to Kurtz when I see him? What are we?
What am I going to say?
What is the sound of his voice? What is the? And he even says that at some point. I didn't think about him in terms of what he looks like, or what we're going to talk about. I thought about him in terms of the sound of his voice and what it would be like and things like that. And it's just something that builds and builds and builds and builds and gets drives him even crazier than the River is driving him.
Turns out he sounds a lot like Marlon Brando.
Yeah. Sounds just like Marlon Brando. But I'm going to give Kurtz a strong one for sure.
Yes, sir.
The idea of Kurtz, I suppose.
All right, Scott, protagonist.
All right, so I would say it's Marlowe. Yes, it's Marlowe telling the story of Everest, if anyone gets that reference. But yeah, so you might say on the outset, he can be a bit dry, and maybe that bleeds over into style and dialogue-ish as well. But, I liked him as a protagonist in the end. It's basically more Marlowe's story, really. It's the story of him encountering Kurtz and how that affected him, and he's now, like you said, now I watch all of you in your safe little houses and you have no idea what it's like, right? I came back with a little glimpse of quote-unquote the horror. So, I think you get a lot of who he is. He tells, his background, some of his previous ship jobs and so forth, adventures he's been on, and ship jobs. You know what I mean? His previous endeavors, like I said, his previous contracts, and he decides he basically sort of does it on a lark, not a lark per se. He's I
think he very much does it on a lark.
Yeah. Kind of yes and no. He's I'm done with the normal stuff. Let's see if I can get command of my own little
I can use the work.
Yeah. Let's see if I can go up the Congo in a steamboat. That seems fun or whatever. Right? And then he encounters
the mouth of madness.
Yes, exactly. Then he encounters all the insanity around him, and of course he's changed by it. So I think he has a pretty good arc. I think he's gets decently fleshed out as it goes on. You get glimpses of who he is, even indirectly when he's describing something else, maybe not necessarily talking about himself, but everything around it, I think, fills out a bunch of his character.
What I really like is I think he's a genuinely good person. He gives food to the people who are dying. But he's cynically disinterested in a lot of what's going on around him.
I think that saves him.
He's just a witness of the events happening around him, and he allows himself to be not affected initially, and then he gets intrigued and more intrigued, and then at the end, I think he's slightly broken by.
That's what I'm saying.
That's when the disease hits him. Is after he meets Kurtz. Africa finally
catches up with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's pretty solid and pretty well fleshed out. And like I said, he's a framework, yes, but he's also more than that. So I think he deserves a 1.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Marlowe is a good which is basically what he is, and tells this interesting story. I'm on his side throughout the
Yes,
book.
does a good job of being
and that's the
sympathetic
best
to him.
thing that I can say about like a good protagonist. I think is like you got me on your side, and I'm interested to see where your story goes. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna give him more.
Just one last part. Stylistically, they do an interesting thing. Is as he's telling the story about this, and occasionally he'll meander. Occasionally he'll go into like philosophy,
Yeah.
and then he has to be interrupted by one of the people,
Like someone on the boat, be like,
his lawyer buddy or
you were
whatever.
saying, yeah. That's fun. It's a nice touch, but it adds a believability to like this is a man telling a story.
But it also gives insight into both how he was affected by the events and himself as a character.
Yes, exactly. Well said. Good final thought on him.
Okay, Stephen, supporting.
So this is an interesting question. I'm both glad and kind of upset that I got it because I would love to have heard you guys talk about supporting
Started off
characters
straight.
first because I don't remember many of them.
I'll help you out.
Just on like the quick run through that I did in the book, like this is my first time going through it. I know you guys have both read it multiple times, but I remember mostly in terms of supporting characters, the helmsman's death. Like that's a very touching scene, and then the Dutchman the Russian in
The foppish Russian guy.
in patches, with all the patches on his clothes, and like those are pretty much the two side characters that I remember well. I know there are a bunch more like throughout like the pilgrims, like he's got all those pilgrims and like you meet some of them from time to time or whatever, but like they don't I don't have like a super great memory of all of them. I don't know, like I don't know what I'm going to give this. So having said that, I'm going to go off to you guys and listen to what you say.
All right, I got
So if
something
you
for
can
you.
spark something in me.
Here's what I've always noticed, and you guys can tell me if I'm completely off the mark. The reason you don't remember a lot of them, like, for example, you got the manager of the outside station, like the one he
Yeah.
comes to first, then the middle station, right? But they're all, like, bumbling, idiotic bureaucrats trying to, like, act civilized and, like, getting increasingly worse at it as it goes on. The reason you don't remember them is because they're mostly interchangeable, and I think that's always been the point. Like...
Oh, especially with the bureaucrats in the middle, in the middle station.
You mentioned
Yeah.
the pilgrims, like, yeah, they all look the same. They're all doing the same ridiculous idiot stuff because that's what they think they should be doing. They don't know anything else. And Marlowe's just like this, standing there like at a distance, like bemusingly being like, what are these fools doing? Right? They're accompanying him. But I'm saying, Steve-O, to me, that's always been Conrad's point. Like these kinds of, the characters are all like more or less the same, at least the ones at that level, because they're totally out of their depth.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that, yeah, you're absolutely right. The one time you really find out about one of the pilgrims is he has a great line, but I'm going to do disservice to it. But like incompetent ginger, or whatever, the guy who's trying to steer ship, he actually gives a lot more information about the Africans in the cannibals that are part of his crew, the helmsman, the fact that he was always like a little bit more swagger when Marlowe was around than when he was
But when
he was
not,
watching.
he's a little shaky.
Yeah. All these the mistress of Kurtz. All these characters are really kind of explored, while most of the
I guess you get a decent amount.
Dutch corporate guys are just
They're literally faces.
You get the manager. I feel like the manager's there the entire time. I don't know shit about him or like anything.
He just like he's
kind of the whole
against Kurtz is his
Yeah.
thing is that because he's basically jealous.
He's being outshone.
Yeah.
And I guess you do get a decent amount about the fiance that Kurt's
Even though
left
you don't get her
behind.
name, his
Yeah.
intended is an important part. Yeah, and I think she was, from what you do get of her when Marlowe meets her at the end, I think you get enough of her character and their exchange that they have there. But all I'm saying is, I'm probably going to give it a 1 because of the fact that I always found it slightly amusing in the way that Marlowe seems to, as a character, seems to be amused at all these, basically the dudes in suits might as well be the same person.
He also
Everyone
describes a lot of them in context of Kurtz.
Yeah.
So it's like this person
This one
disliked Kurtz.
yeah,
this one
exactly.
is jealous that way, and that's what's important to him in this story is Kurtz is the most interesting man
in the world. In the Congo.
Do any of the secondary characters have an arc? I don't think so.
Helmsman, kind of.
He dies.
He has
That's his arc.
He has a meaningful death, I suppose.
I didn't really know shit
but-
about him before.
That's a
he
good
died,
question. Like,
you know?
but the point is, to me, is like they're going to keep doing this. They're saying like blowing up the mine to mine things to build a railroad that's never going to exist.
What's funny
gonna keep
is
going on.
Are any of them more than like a fixture in Marlowe's life? Because and not to keep bringing it back, but like in Apocalypse Now, they do have arcs. Like
Sure.
secondary characters do have arcs.
Now, I get what you mean.
Do any of these characters have an arc? I might give this a 0 because I don't think any of them do much more than be a lamp in this story. You know, like they're not more than like a piece of furniture.
I see what you mean, but I always thought like I said, I made my argument for why I might give it a 1 just because of that angle. But while I do agree, like they don't have arcs per se, I think their tendrils like bleed over into themes, and then like they're like half characters and half thematic representations.
See, that would work in a shorter story. The sheer length of Heart of Darkness and the fact that's a really good point, Stu.
I really wanted to, because as we were talking about this, I was like thinking about it, and I was like,
I'm kind of wavering.
I don't
too,
think
like,
anybody really has a.
They don't.
His friends don't really have a purpose on there. It's just it's a story about Marlowe and Kurtz.
Yeah,
and other people were there bumbling around. Well, yeah, it's tough. I'm thinking about it now because I was pretty easily set on giving it a 1 from what I said, but
I think I'm going to give it a 0.
you do make a solid point.
You did make a good point, and I'll agree with you.
I think at the end, yeah, I think you got me when you parsed it out that in a shorter work that might have been he could have got away with that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
you know, you don't need.
I think that's the crux of it here. So I'm going to switch to a 0. Yeah, well done.
I'm on the dialogue, and well, the horror is one of the most famous lines of all time. We discussed it already, but overall, actually, the fact that they're doing because we've talked about this before, it's a narrator talking about it, but they actually do a good job of including dialogue in that, even if it's perhaps not what was unreliable in the sense that it's reminiscence, but overall, I felt that it was better than serviceable. They did a good job. I think the characters are distinct. The bureaucrats have a certain way of speaking. The Russian certainly does, and that conversation they have is perhaps one. And then meeting Kurtz at the end and his bloviating.
Yeah. His feverish rantings. Sorry, I don't have much to add. I do think that there are a couple good lines. I had a couple picked out, but I'm not going to read them now. But I do think that
you don't want to look through that 100-page thing.
Yeah, I don't know where I didn't mark them. I should have made better notes. But I definitely remember, like you brought up in the plot, where Marlowe sometimes in the midst of telling a story will like meander off and start philosophizing a bit. But I thought some of that stuff, what he says there, is like pretty, like could be profound. It's just that as the audience, like surrogately, they're like, and then what happened?
Actually, my favorite one's when he starts talking shit about his friends' jobs and how they're like, hey, watch it now.
Yeah. So like, I think it's all very well done. It's not, maybe not natural, but certainly pertinent, relevant to what's happening as, again, he goes increasingly like bizarre and surreal situations, and much of the dialogue reflects it and can be quite poetic at times. I do really love the dialogue in this. I'm going to give it a 1. I don't have much more to say other than what you guys said, but I think that it's really well done, and I'm going to give it a 1.
All right, Scott, style.
Yeah, so this might be a bit of a bumpy one. I'm not sure, because it's as if most people who've read it or even familiar with it say like, oh, it's dry. I'm like, it kind of can be, like, but it's not like fucking Moby Dick, which I feel like a lot of people like have that in their minds, like reading this is like that. It's not. It can be a little stilted, but I argue for like similar to dialogue, and even more so, like many descriptions, like you said, some of them can be superfluous. Yes, okay. Yeah. But by and large, I think like he has an excellent style and it still holds up. It only feels a little dated to me, like not as much as, again, the perception to me seems to be around it. So personally, I enjoy the style of Heart of Darkness quite a bit. I think it stands. It's aged pretty well versus some other stuff. So, and again, some of the descriptions, some of the way he paints a picture, as you said.
Actually, I have an interesting argument, and I didn't come up with this on my own. It was part of the notes, the annotations on it, where it's towards the end when they're attacked on the boat, and he's describing like just let the pole drop in the water like like a lazy guy, and like he's describing for like a whole paragraph of ending, and then realizes they're under attack. They're saying that this was a kind of a style like very distinctive Conrad, where he would lead you down a path not knowing what was going to happen, and then do a reveal.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if I was
pretty
actually very
effective.
impressed
Yeah.
when
That's
they
a good
pointed
point.
that out.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. I think that the literary style of this is pretty impressive. I really liked it, as you were saying, Scott. I think it holds up pretty well to this day. The social stylistics, perhaps not, as we talked
the
about a little bit
construction
earlier.
of words that he uses
But
to compose the
doesn't
story.
exactly hold up. But like, yeah, it is a well done book, and the like as we've said several times, or as maybe I've said several times, the like descent into madness narrative is really well done.
I mean, this is like
really
the codifier of
impressively
it
done
in many ways. Yeah.
Well, like Apocalypse Now, this has to balance both the absurdity along with actually selling you on the horrors of what's happening
Yeah,
around you.
Exactly.
And
I think
he
it
has
does
scenes in there where I felt like I was watching awful things happen to people.
Yeah.
And getting kind of slightly emotional in that, when he's talking about all the people just like going out to the grove to die.
Mhm.
Or like worked to death and just
or-
left there. Yeah.
Guy crawling on hands and knees to get a drink of water from the river.
Yeah.
It's like, geez, like this is like, who could allow something like this to exist? And when you find out the absurdity of the person who's allowing this to happen, it really does. I think what makes this an effective work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Give it
man.
one.
Good points. Yep.
Also, heads on pikes. Very, very
Heads on pikes, yes.
impressive imagery.
Well, that's to the point where I believe he describes it as like decorations, and then only to
Yeah,
realize
he
their
thought
heads
it,
later.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Because
set it
one
up
is
and
turned
reveal.
towards
Yeah,
him. I
it's
think it was
the
like-
like you said, the setup and then the sort of reversal, as you mentioned as well there. But yeah, for sure, one on style for me.
Okay, so
One,
Stephen, recommendation?
Yes. Read this story with the caveat that if you are not interested in reading some racist shit, like, just don't. It's not like it's you know what? Well, I was gonna say just watch Apocalypse Now, but that's also fairly racist in parts. So, I don't know. There's a very fascinating story in here, and I think that it's worth reading. But if you're not up for that type of thing, if you think that is gonna be bad for you, then don't bother. It's a great story, but it is a bad. There are bad parts to it as well.
Yeah. I love this work regardless of the societal implications of it. I also suggest that, we were talking about colonialization, whether you're dealing with the perceptions of Native Americans or in Congo or South America. Generally, colonization has its roots because you have to dehumanize the people you're exploiting in some fashion.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes you uncomfortable, as it should make you
it's supposed to be
uncomfortable,
that way.
because it you want to you need to see how terrible these people actually are. So I'm going to give it a recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, you get the caveat there, like it's unavoidably there in the work, but I think I'm going to argue for it's such an influential work, and so many other things have used it in various ways and maybe to various successes, but nevertheless, it's a landmark of modern American fiction, and I think it's sort of there, not that you have to, but to understand a lot of
American?
things, you should read it.
Where's Conrad from?
Poland
But
and English.
It's not American fiction. Well, it's a
you
a
know what I
landmark
mean.
of modern Western
Yes,
fiction, I
sure.
suppose.
You're right.
Yeah.
I'll block judge it, but that's more or less what I meant. And yeah, it's been studied a lot for a good reason. I still think it stands as a piece of literature as well as all the things we said about it, especially thematically. So yes.
I just want to make a quick caveat. There is something that really irritates me about Conrad, not particularly in this work, but in other work of his,
Yeah.
how much he sucks up to England. It is awful.
Sun never sets in the British Empire.
Well,
Huge Anglophile.
Yeah, no, but he because he's not British, but he lived there and he wanted to be like, I love Britain. Like they
Yeah.
can't do anything wrong, and it's
They can get nationalistic, yes.
yeah. But
And so can he.
Anyway,
But as it stands, I do think it's worth it. It's
it is good. It's
I recommend
it's
it.
really impressive work.
yes. All right. So,
What do we got?
actually, didn't do the math.
Pretty sure I gave it an 8.
Someone, 1, 2, 3.
It's all
4.
8s, I think.
Yep.
For the same reasons, possibly. 'Cause
It's
you
all the same
convinced us.
reasons.
Yeah.
So, we give it 8s. We detracted a little bit because of style, because it's kind of an older work, and Conrad is kind of has a distinct writing style. And also, it's a story about Marlowe and Kurtz, and not much about anyone else. Everyone else is set dressing for their story.
Yeah.
So, but overall, I think an 8 is fair. And yeah, I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, and I have to go colonize somewhere with Scott Thurlow.
Scott's
Don't forget my ivory. Good night.
Stephen Ramosi.
I think that was my sign-off line. I'll see you later.
See you next time.
Editing and engineering by Stephen Ramosi. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.